Dean, let's move on. Now I will give the floor to a former European MP, Mr. Chrysostomos, a constitutional law expert. I'll give him the floor.
Thank you very much. Christian values as part of the day-to-day political life in our times are of increasing importance. Christian teaching is a system of ideas that was created in a historical period that is clearly analogous to what we're witnessing in the beginning of the 21st century. They're very similar. It was created in the Mediterranean area under the Roman Empire at the time, in a period, for those of you who have studied history, characterized by demographic and economic decline, combined with ecological crisis. A similar environment, as far as demographic and ecological environmental crises are concerned, will have to be managed by mostly European leaderships today in an economic context which appears to be one of growth. Although the growth does not benefit the entire society, it only benefits part of it. Economic and social inequalities are growing. And this was the case in the first centuries AD in the Roman Empire. So there are clear historical analogies. In other words, the answers Christianity tried to give at the time are relevant today because the problems are largely similar or analogous. The key ideas of Christian teaching, in my humble opinion, are two with regards to what should be done politically and socially. First of all, the value of solidarity. You have two coats. Give one to the person next to you. According to the gospel. This is largely the opposite, considering the economic policies applied in many European countries, not just European, of course. And it also opposes the prevailing mentality of endless consumption we were dragged in by a modern way of life. No need to say more about that. It is clear. In actual fact, what we're experiencing today could be named the capitalism of Matthew. In other words, quite the opposite of Christian values. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read, "Those who have will get more in abundance. But those who do not have will lose the little they have." That referred to spiritual matters in the gospel, but here we have a reversal of Christian ideas. Economic policies favoring the haves at the expense of the have-nots. What is the result? Well, the result is that wages for laborers dropped, in real terms, dropped below the levels estimated by Karl Marx 1.5 centuries later as the threshold of wages. Marx used to say that wages for laborers is what is necessary for the reproduction of the labor force. That's the key idea of Marxism. And that there's an additional value that is that goes to the capitalists. But this is not the case today, as reality proves. When we're talking about reproduction of the labor force, we should also consider the money needed for people to reproduce themselves. The birth rate, for instance, for the birth rate to be 2.1. This is the threshold. Then population dwindles. The birth rate in Europe today is 1.5. In Greece, 1.3. Or maybe less. We have the worst demographic problem worldwide in this country. So, in actual fact, wages are below those levels. And this is similar to the period of Roman decline. Slaves used to be the main labor force back then. But their living conditions were such that prevented their reproduction in numbers. And that was the beginning of the economic decline of the empire as well. In the 4th, 5th centuries AD, led to the collapse in the Middle Ages. Therefore, we need economic policies geared towards redistribution from the haves to have-nots, a special emphasis on the new generation, the young generation, and families with children to ensure sustainability of European families, otherwise, in societies. Otherwise, European societies will not be sustainable. Migration is not our problem, as the extreme right tries to convince us. When you have 1.5 children in Europe per woman, and next door in Africa you have 4 children per woman, you will get a tsunami. So centrally, the European Union should adopt policies to remedy the demographic problem in consultation with the African Union, following negotiations, in exchange for funding, of course, so that Africa also adopts birth control policies, like the ones that worked in China and controlled its demographic developments in the past. That's about demography. As far as Europe is concerned, we need policies that will help resolve the demographic problem, which is existential for every society. And Greece fares worse than any other society for geographical reasons, among others. The second key teaching, the second key idea, that's my own reading, of course, I can understand there can be other approaches, is a respect for nature. For Christianity, nature, in other words, ecological balance, spoke of nature and ecological balance as the product of divine will. This means respect for nature. And man, by the way, a very recent animal species, to the extent we know, the history of the Earth is billions of years. Homo has a history of 2 million years. Homo sapiens has a history of 100 or 200,000 years. So we're talking about a very young animal species that climbed up the food ladder very fast. man looks like a Banana Republic dictator among other animal species and behaves in that way. The impact of human activity on ecological balance is breathtaking. Eminent scientists describe the 21st century as the Desertozoic era. The rates of extinction of species as a collateral damage of human activity is breathtaking as well. One of the results is climate crisis, the climate catastrophe we are beginning to witness, with implications that are very hard to fathom. So we need to respect ecological balance more. We need to realize that we're not the owners of this planet. There's no other planet. We are using natural resources at a pace which is not sustainable. So globally, the problem is quite the opposite of the problem we have in Europe. In the rest of the planet, there's a dazzling increase of the population. Other continents are more or less balanced, but Africa is not. It's growing. The population is growing at a very fast pace. So it's not possible with the existing technology. The American way of life cannot spread across the planet as political leaderships attempt to do. So we need to change policies, both in Europe and globally, particularly in these two directions: more solidarity in human societies, and more respect, much more respect, since there's very little respect nowadays for nature. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chrysogonos. He drew comparisons between today and times of Christ. I don't know if there's enough time, as another speaker said, but undoubtedly his 2 points on the demographic problem and respect for the environment are relevant, in my humble opinion. We need to harness the demographic crisis in Africa while boosting the European continent, where population is aging. And climate change that has become climate crisis in our days reminds us our duty as Christians to respect the environment. It's been pointed out on many occasions by the Ecumenical Patriarch, who's also described as a green patriarch. Respect for nature is respect for creation, therefore respect for the Creator. Mr. Stamoulis, I would suggest we give the floor to Reverend Thomas Veep, President of the European Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace, CEC. Reverend, you have the floor.
Thank you. Moderator, dear friends, sorry that I don't speak your old language. I had to learn Greek, of course, in my theological studies to understand and read New Testament, but sorry, I can't speak your language. I would like to share 4 reflections with you. But first, perhaps, I have to mention that the European Council of Religious Leaders is the most representative interreligious council in Europe, with representatives of all world religions. But I have been invited by CEC because I think I was president of the Protestant Reformed Church in Switzerland and of the community of Protestant churches in Europe. My first point, that the fact that this conference here in Thessaloniki happens also with CEC and COMECE on this specific topic of Christian values is an important sign. We talked about yesterday how Europe and European countries are changing due to political, economic, sociological, and ideological developments. We were not used to asking in this direct way about Christian roots and becoming aware of them, and about Christian values that have helped shape Europe from the beginning and in which Europe is rooted. It was somehow evident, even if historically we could never just speak of a Christian Europe. But these changes, we thought about, no country and no religious community can escape. Also, our societies, our churches, the membership is changing. We cannot escape. That means that we need to be more aware of these Christian roots and values. That is why that's my first point. I'm grateful for this initiative of the Orthodox churches and all the organizations being in the organization. Secondly, but we have also become aware that we could think even more, and we should think even more about what Christian and European values really are. As I understand, values comes from personal convictions, from a lively engagement with the biblical roots, with our biblical roots, from a faith relationship, from listening, thinking, and it also has to do with the Holy Spirit, who ignites the Pentecost fire of faith and trust in us, but also gives us courage and to confess. Even among us Christians, there is always a need to find out what is important in our life, in our personal life and existence before God, and also in our common social life. We cannot simply postulate Christian values. We must try to live them in all our limitations and weaknesses, also as churches together. The third, we heard some analysis of today's intellectual, spiritual, and political changes about the situation in Europe, which, for my understanding, were a bit too pessimistic. We truly do not come from the promised land, living Christian values also in the past. This also has to do with us, with what we did and what we do, what we did not and what we don't. That's why, and it was also mentioned yesterday, we should remain humble despite our convictions. In comparison to experiences that you probably have in some Orthodox countries, and I am grateful for that, my experience, of course, as a parish pastor and church leader is more influenced by a very differentiated post-secular situation. But I can tell you, I don't come from a godless part of Europe. They are not simply non-believer societies, as I heard here yesterday. People, including young people, And by the way, I would like to suggest that the next conference, the students are involved here, because it was very interesting to listen what they think. Members of the church, they live values every day that we can describe Christian values. I could give you now a lot of examples of our churches in Western Europe, but I don't do it, you can imagine. Of course, all our churches have the great challenge of passing on the faith to the next generation. My concern, if you allow, is that we should not answer and approach the important question of your conference, politics as an area for expressing Christian values in everyday life, from a purely negative analysis, from a deficit mindset. I'm happy about the situation in many Orthodox churches, but they live in other circumstances, and in Europe we belong together. We will find open hearts and open doors, approaching also politicians with our convictions as Christians. This is my experience in speaking to many politicians in my country. They hardly ever talk about their faith in public, because that might be also our sober, reformed Swiss style. But they are happy to have serious conversations with partners from the churches who take their work for serious and their efforts, support them in it, but not simply making demands. The same applies to the members of the European Parliament. As a Swiss, I don't have a member of my country, unfortunately, in this parliament, but we have good advocates. And it applies to all other parliaments. With this in mind, I would like to wish all candidates good luck and all the best. You will represent your country, but also much more as member of the European Parliament. My last point is a kind request or suggestion. Dear friends, don't walk this path you are beginning now, becoming more aware and strengthening Christian values in Europe. Don't walk this path alone. I'm grateful for your initiative. With CEC and COMECE, you have very important European bodies, church bodies, on board. However, I think that this connection between Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Christian in general, that this should be strengthened in order to deepen the European community, which is above all community of peace and a community of values. We belong together. Even we have historical, theological, ideological, liturgical, and ethical priorities. We don't agree everywhere, and talking about beginning of life and end of life with a Swiss Protestant theologian might raise some questions when we do it. But we try to do our best from our faith. We belong together as Christians. But we want the best for the people, also for the people who live differently than we are and do with other forms of life, for example. But all these people, that's my experience, belong to our churches. and will remain members of our churches if we take them seriously and recognize them as brothers and sisters in faith. We can discuss about all these ethical questions, and we should discuss. Unity in reconciled diversity is the motto of the Community of Protestant Churches in Europe, for example. Perhaps that's my humble suggestion, a continuation of this initiative you started here from the Orthodox background, a continuation in Brussels or wherever which takes up and expands this initiative would be helpful. It would not be about the Christian demonstration of power, but rather about us together wanting to make our spiritual and ethical contribution to the whole of Europe together as Christians. And really at last, in order to take into account the religious reality in Europe, it would be certainly also be important to consider how and where the spiritual and peacemaking potential of all other religions, traditions should be invited to work together. Interreligious cooperation has become very difficult. That's what I experience as president of the ECL every day. But we lose nothing if, inspired by our Christian values, we set out together as people with and without religious commitments for the benefit of a peaceful Europe. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον εδεσιμότατο Thomas Wipp.
Thank you very much, Reverend Thomas Wipp, President of the European Council of Religious Leaders. He has a long experience, and what he put to the table can be assessed and discussed